Greetings all. In case you live under a rock or missed the last video, I've seen the metrics and y'all slept on my favorite unit. So here's a brief refresh. The imperial conquest of England in 1066 allowed the first Norman king, William, to experiment with a new type of lordship. In theory, he commanded the allegiance of everyone in England, but in practice, he needed to impose his will on his subjects, often by force. He adapted the highly effective administrative structures of his Anglo-Saxon predecessors to meet his own needs. So join us as we have an overview of English, French, Spanish, and basically Eastern European and Slavic kingship throughout the 12th century.
God, what did someone do to you this morning?
It might be because YouTube is awful at recognizing my educational content, I would suppose, but nonetheless, I digress.
But yes, you might say William took England from conquest to consolidation. Conquest was carried forward by William's sons, especially Henry I, who reigned between 1100 and 1135. Now, he approached kingship by focusing on effective governance rather than warfare. He strengthened the Anglo-Norman system of local administration and instituted a system of traveling judges to administer royal justice. He introduced a method of financial accounting, which was carried out by an office known as the Exchequer, to calculate receipts and expenditures. Now, Henry's hands-on approach to royal lordship wasn't popular and resulted in civil war, until England began to long for a centralized rule.
Henry's grandson, that is to say Henry of Anjou, 1154 to 89, at the age of 21 was already the Duke of Normandy, the Lord of Anjou and Maine. He also controlled Aquitaine thanks to a marriage to his powerful ruler Eleanor, 1122 to 1204, who had annulled her first marriage to the French king Louis VII. His measures brought an unprecedented number of people into the exercise of government and increased their sense of loyalty to the king.
Now consider Henry II's Angevin Empire. He restored his grandfather's administration and extended its reach. He ordered reliable local men, organized into juries, to report every major crime that occurred in their districts, and also empowered them to investigate civil cases. He made it easier for common people to seek justice in the royal courts. His innovations were the origin of the modern Anglo-American legal system.
Here we have Henry II's empire in the Kingdom of France, 1180 to 1223. What areas did Henry II's empire control as of 1180? What advantages would the King of France have when challenging English control over continental territories? Even though his own power is effectively confined to the island, i.e. the island around Paris.
Now, certain innovations brought Henry into conflict with the church. He extended royal law at the expense of canon law, whereby bishops tried accused clerics. Henry declared that clerics convicted of serious crimes in church courts should lose their clerical status and be handed over to the royal court for sentencing. Principle: clerics should be English subjects before they were servants of the church.
Here we have Abelard and Heloise. This image from a 13th century manuscript shows Abelard in a scholar's gown and cap and Heloise wearing a nun's habit. Their gestures indicate that they were engaged in a lively debate. The story of their fervent attraction and doomed marriage was already famous during their lifetimes, and by the time this manuscript was copied, theirs had become the ultimate example of star-crossed love. The letters of Abelard and Heloise are a series of passionate and intellectual correspondences written in Latin throughout the 12th century. The authors, that is to say Peter Abelard, was a prominent theologian, and his pupil, Heloise, a gifted young woman, later renowned as an abbess. They would exchange these letters following their ill-fated love affair and subsequent monastic lives. Yes, it's technically a student-teacher relationship. I'm not getting into it. The letters do reveal the personal and intellectual relationship between Abelard and Heloise. They also provide an intimate glimpse into the social context of the 12th century in Europe. They've played a significant role in the development of Western epistolary literature. They also attracted attention from historians, literary scholars, and general readers alike. You can still read them today.
Speaking of clergy, let's spend a moment on Thomas Beckett. Now, Thomas Becket was a longtime friend and Archbishop of Canterbury who feared Henry's goal was to undermine the clergy. Henry exiled Thomas, and when Thomas returned in 1170, Henry's knights assassinated him.
Thomas would quite quickly be proclaimed a martyr and a saint. His tomb at Canterbury would become one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe. Henry was compelled to actually visit the tomb barefoot and penitent to ask for the saint's forgiveness for his sins. Henry did retain the right to nominate clerics to high office and exercise a large measure of control over the court's personnel. The English government would function so well that Richard the Lionheart, who we'll get to in a minute, 1189 to 99, and his short 10-year rule would only see him in the country for 6 months. Now, here is a depiction of the murder of Thomas Becket. Surprise, surprise. In this illumination from a 13th century prayer book, one of the knights has struck the archbishop so violently that he has broken his own sword. So, I ask you, how might a contemporary viewer have interpreted this symbolism?
Speaking of the unsatisfactory rule of Richard, his bureaucrats did most of the work. Let's move on to his much maligned maleficence, John. Richard died while besieging a castle and was succeeded by his brother John, who reigned between 1199 and 1216. By 1204, military and legal losses forced John to cede nearly all of his father's continental possessions to the King of France, Philip II, and only Aquitaine remained. This was politically disastrous for John and depleted his resources. John's response was an attempt to recover the lost territories by raising taxes to equip an army, which angered the nobility further.
As he angered the lords of England, many of whom were of Norman descent who lost their ancestral lands when John, of course, loses Normandy, they generate a charter specifically established to create a representative body of barons, i.e., Parliament. The Magna Carta would normalize the idea that a strong representative government was, in fact, a good thing. And in time, Parliament would become a legislative body that could help govern the kingdom, since Magna Carta demanded that no taxation be imposed without common consent of the realm. Kings had to convene Parliament to explain why such taxation was necessary. And John's attitude about Magna Carta and his overall attitude about how he was above all nobility didn't help his case either. He was a real prick about it. But meetings of Parliament also would be used to hear judicial cases, review local administration and complaints of injustice. They would also promulgate new laws. England would gradually see itself changing from a conquered territory within the Norman Empire into a constitutional monarchy grounded in the government and, of course, ruled by law.
And thus we have one of the most important legal documents in all history, the Magna Carta. In 1215, John was forced to set his seal to the Magna Carta. The king could levy no taxes without the consent of the kingdom at large. No free man could be punished until he was judged guilty by a jury of his peers. And no one could be arrested and imprisoned without a warrant. And no unqualified person should hold public office.
Note this repeals the active Anglo-Saxon hunting that the Normans were going on up to this point, as up to this point it was legal for a Norman to kill an Anglo-Saxon, but not the other way around. John would be crowned King of England in 1199. Richard had died without any legitimate heirs, thus John inherits Richard's throne as his only surviving brother. Yet, when Richard was king, he had spent a significant amount of time and money fighting wars in France and going on crusades. On his return from fighting in the Crusades, he was actually captured and held ransom in what is now modern day Germany by Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor. He was released once the debt was paid in 1194. This actually further affected England's finances, effectively causing a recession. During Richard's time as a captive, though, John would work with King Philip II of France to try and seize the throne of England. This was ultimately unsuccessful, and Richard and John would eventually make peace with each other upon Richard's brief return to England. During his reign, which lasted just under 10 years, Richard had spent some 6 months in England fighting. The Crusades had been expensive. England was heavily in debt. King John's reign has often been criticized, but he had to manage both the clashes with the Pope and France, as well as the struggles with his own barons, not to mention his superiority complex. He also had to deal with these problems without any sort of finance to successfully manage them, hence his raising of taxes. So John undoubtedly made mistakes during his reign, this is true, but he did inherit several challenges, predominantly from Richard I. So we can't entirely blame John for the problem he is in, and yet at the exact same time, we can also entirely blame John for the problem he found himself in. So I ask you then, how has the monarch been limited throughout British history, not just John, but others moving forward?
From all the territory John cedes to the Franks, we gain a new French kingdom. Although weak, the Capetian dynasty, founded during the Viking raids, was fortunate. It produced an unbroken line of able male heirs for over 300 years, from 987 to 1328. It produced men who were also long-lived. Each Capetian king ruled for 30 years, which greatly contributed to the political stability. Although small, the kingdom was a rich center of agriculture and trade, which provided a steadily increasing source of income.
The Capetians were also shrewd politicians. The epitome of these strengths, of course, is shown by Philip II, 1180 to 1223, as he styles himself Philip Augustus, the first to be king of France, which is why we'll now be calling it France. Philip came to the throne at the age of 18, having witnessed the struggles of his father, Louis VII, and Henry II, and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He understood that he could not win a direct confrontation against Henry or Richard. John was another matter. The prestige of the Capetians would be enhanced by their patronage of the new University of Paris, founded in part by Abelard, which made the royal city the intellectual capital of Europe, and thus brought money in.
As you may have guessed, Philip would have more success with John. He declared that John owed him homage and allegiance in return for Normandy and its adjacent territories. He took advantage of his position as John's overlord to undermine John's control over these lands. When John objected, Philip declared all John's lands forfeit to the French crown and backed this declaration with armies that won decisive victories in 1204 and 1214.
Philip's son, Louis VIII, 1223 to 26, also extended this strategy to the newly conquered territories in the southeast. Now, while I could say more here about Philip II, I think we really must move on. Though, one quick point on his governance and his effectiveness. Notice in the coming slides here how Philip manipulates his lords. Remember our conversation about feudalism and the tension between the lords, i.e., the nobility, and the king. How some lords and kings manipulate this relationship. We just saw it with Magna Carta and John, but Philip does something a little different, particularly with his raising up of the landless poor knights into the noble class.
With these conquests, Philip had the resources to build an effective system of local administration, and he maintained the existing bureaucratic structures. He appointed royal overseers, or bailiffs, who had full judicial, administrative, and military authority.
And Philip will draw these bailiffs from needy knights and lesser nobility of his own domain. He would rotate them out frequently from region to region, effectively to ensure their loyalty, but also to prevent them from developing personal ties in the areas in which they're governing, so they can't gather an army and rebel against him, as an example. Now, as a reminder, the differences between the German, French, and English kingship will be on the test. And speaking of the Germans,
Emperor Frederick, later known as Barbarossa, who reigned from 1152 to 1190. He coined the term the Holy Roman Empire to describe his realm, asserting that its holiness derived from the blessing of God and did not depend on the intervention of the Pope.
shots fired.
He forged a close alliance with other German princes by supporting their efforts to control their own territories. In exchange, he exacted their support for his efforts to reassert imperial control over the wealthy cities of northern Italy.
Imperial power will weaken throughout the 11th century, but in the middle of the 12th century, a newly elected emperor would make an attempt to restore German monarchy, and, of course, to free it from papal control, as you might guess. Frederick attempted to skirt the power of the papacy by supporting anti-popes, Pope Alexander III as an example, reigning 1159 to 81, would broker a deal. Recognize my rule, Pope Alexander says, in Rome, and I recognize your domains and your overlordship of the church in yours. And Frederick thought this was aces. And ironically, the strategy worked. But sadly, it did spark a series of wars, namely led by Milan and supported by Rome. The northern Italian city states would create the Lombard League, which would ultimately defeat Frederick. However, they would guarantee their independence from Frederick in exchange for large cash payouts. So, to summarize, Frederick is now freed from the Pope, no longer has to fight with his neighbors, and while he technically lost the war, he's getting all of the money he wanted from them to begin with? God, Barbarossa was great.
When Frederick left for the Holy Land in 1189, he left his realm in a powerful position. Although he died on that venture, his policies bore fruit in the reign of his son, Henry VI, who succeeded to his father's throne without opposition, and also enjoyed a huge income from the North Italian towns. And he also became the King of Sicily, strengthening the empire's position even further. Now, when Frederick II came of age, the German princes had become so autonomous that all he could do was recognize their privileges in exchange for their loyalty. In Italy, the cities of the Lombard League had ceased to pay their taxes, and the powerful administrative structure of Sicily had fallen into chaos.
Well, it was nice while it lasted. When Henry died in 1197, he left his only 3-year-old son, Frederick II, as the heir apparent. 2 decades of civil war will, of course, follow Frederick's death until he comes of age. Until Frederick II comes of age, that is. But for the next 500 years, until the founding of the modern German and Italian states, political power in these lands, that of the Holy Roman Empire especially, will be divided amongst several hundred territorial princes and independent cities. You think Greece was bad? Hoo boy.
Now, Frederick made the mistake of asserting a right to rule the northern Italian cities directly, bypassing their own independent governments. Another Lombard League and a lengthy war, which continued until Frederick's death in 1250. The papacy excommunicated Frederick and denied the right of his heirs. When Frederick's last legitimate son died in 1254, the prospect of effective imperial rule died with him.
In addition to Crusades, the War of the Keys, Henry VII's revolt, the war over Lombardy in Italy, Mongol raids, the rocky relationship with the new Pope Innocent IV, Frederick had a great thirst for knowledge and learning. Frederick employed Jews from Sicily who had migrated there from the Holy Land. At least he employed them at his court to translate Greek and Arabic works. He also introduced paper into the European court. The death of Frederick II in 1250 and of his son Conrad IV in 54 heralded the irreversible decline of the Habsstaufen power in Germany and in the conjoint kingdoms of Naples and Sicily. Conrad's infant son Conradin, heir to Naples and Sicily, would remain in Germany under the guardianship of his Bavarian mother. No one foresaw the rise of Prussia, and that would ultimately prevent a unified German state for the next several hundred years. And speaking of state, here is the Holy Roman Empire and, of course, the Central and Eastern Europe, as of about 1200. Here's the Holy Roman Empire and Central and Eastern Europe as of about 1200. This map approximates the borders of the region's major territories. Identify the kingdoms and principalities discussed in the chapter. If you were the ruler of any one of them, what opportunities do you see for the expansion of your own power, but also what limitations? Remember, these are all effectively warring city-states. Why would the prospect of a single heir to the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Two Sicilies be a threat to the papacy?
Now, there's much more to the world than these three kingdoms, so let's cast our net a little wider, specifically the states of Central and Eastern Europe. Like other principalities that made up the Holy Roman Empire, Bohemia was a non-hereditary monarchy, whose rulers were elected by powerful families. This changed at the end of the 12th century when Ottokar, who reigned between 1192 and 1230, managed to secure papal and imperial support for the establishment of a dynasty. He extended the rule into Moravia. In the 13th century, Bohemia emerged as one of the strongest states in Central Europe.
Kings of Hungary would cultivate a strong and relatively centralized royal authority and expand Hungarian influence into Transylvania and Croatia, which of course have silver mines. The wealth of King Bela III, 1172 to 96, exceeded that of his European contemporaries. He would adopt many of the techniques favored by them, including the use of written records to aid in royal governance.
Poland was carved into several smaller dukedoms after 1138, when King Boleslaw III, who reigned between 1107 and 1138, divided his lands among his sons. This led to competition among members of the same dynasty, which also spurred the Polish dukes to seek out new opportunities for advancing their interests. Other Polish rulers successfully pursued more inclusive methods of strengthening their principalities. The Polish dukes encouraged Jewish settlements, knowing that their cities would benefit from Jewish merchants, craftsmen, and bankers. By the 13th century, there was a massive Jewish immigration to Poland. The Statute of Kalush, issued by Duke Boleslaw the Pious in 1264.
The Statute of Kalis granted the Jews of Greater Poland extensive legal rights and privileges, including freedom of movement, worship, equal rights under the law, the right to prosecute Christians who insulted, harassed, or stole from them. It is often regarded as a foundational document in the history of human rights, and a rare to the Jewish people who were often, well, the subject of many of those same abuses. As a result of these inclusive initiatives, Poland became a magnet for Jews for the remainder of the Middle Ages, accepting more refugees from the expulsions from England, France, and Spain than anyone else.
Now farther east, to your beloved Rus. The settlements established by the Viking Rus centered on Kiev, but subsequent crusading movements weakened Byzantium and disrupted trade with the Islamic world. Kiev was undermined and power was passed to Novgorod in the north. Already economically powerful and ideally placed to take advantage of trade with the peoples of the Baltic region and Scandinavia via the Volga and the Dnieper rivers. Also functioned as a powerful city-state and the center of an entity called the Novgorod Republic.
Novgorod, the city that could have been. Was ultimately affected by the changing fortunes. In a series of wars, the Swedes would successfully invade Novgorod's northern frontier. There were consistent skirmishes with both the Danes and also Germans. In 1240, a Swedish army would be routed by the Prince of Novgorod as an Alexander, 1221 to 63, who thereafter gained the name Alexander Nevsky, if you know him by that title. Alexander would be credited with the defeat of the Teutonic Knights in 1242 as well. And when Constantinople was sacked by Latin Crusaders in 1204, many German and Scandinavian warlords would begin to make the Orthodox Christians of Rus the target of their crusading fervor, as they really failed to take it out on anyone else.
Now, the last kingdom for today is Spain, or what will eventually become Spain. By the middle of the 12th century, there were four major Christian kingdoms. In the far north was Navarre and Leon Castile, which governed as a united kingdom from 1037. In the south was a broad swath of Islamic territory. In the east, the Crown of Aragon, formed in 1137 when the Count of Barcelona married the Queen of Aragon.
Small Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula would be distinct, but the unified Kingdom of Spain would eventually emerge as the most powerful monarchy in Europe. But we'll get there. And key to this development was the successful alliances forged amongst the peninsula's Christian rulers and their eventual defeat of the Islamic kingdoms. This process is termed the Reconquista, conceptualizing the struggle as a holy war gave it papal support as well. And castles would dot the landscape due to centuries of warfare between Muslims, Christians, and, of course, competing Christian clans. They would serve as multiple bases of power, sometimes changing hands quite rapidly. To the west, the new Kingdom of Portugal would win its independence from Leon Castile in 1139. The Reconquista, or the Reconquest of Spain, 900 to 1250, as you see here. Let's consider some questions. What were the frontiers of the Christian kingdoms as of 900? How about in 1150 and 1250? What geographical factors might have helped to sustain these small kingdoms? Why might Castile eventually have become the largest of these Christian kingdoms? How could Aragon and Catalonia have maintained important positions as wealthy and significant powers?
The two strongest powers were Aragon and Castile. This is exemplified by King Alfonso II of Aragon, who reigned between 1162 and 1196, and was the first king of a united Aragon. The Christian influence spread south throughout the remainder of the 12th century and into the 13th century. The last Islamic dominion was the small kingdom centered on Granada. Castile became the largest kingdom, though was rivaled in wealth by the more urbanized and commercially connected Aragon. Wars between these two states continued until the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, which joined the two lands in a unified Spanish monarchy.
They would use documentation as a tool of power, presiding over the compilation of the Big Book of Fiefs between 1192 and 94, which recounted property transactions and family lineages dating back centuries, citing documents in the royal archives, and thus also using said documents to lie about it because nobody else could fact check them except for those in the royal archives. It's a great racket. Kings of this region came to deploy a mixture of violent conquest and the development of effective administrative structures to make their power real. Here we have Lore Castle, Aragon. No single photograph can capture the size or setting of this massive castle complex in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Initially, though, it was fortified in the 11th century as a base for the Christian expansion into Islamic territory. However, it would be further enlarged in the 12th century, and the encircling wall and towers would be added in the 13th and 14th centuries, respectively.
Alas, that is all we have time for today. Next time we move on to the Crusader states, a slew of crusades, and the slaughtering of innocents, and much, much more.